My name is Jake Miller, and I'm 32 years old. I'm currently working as a temp worker. The hours are consistent, and the job stress is minimal as a temp worker, even if the pay isn't great. On top of that, I'm supporting my single mom out of my mere earnings, so my living situation isn't exactly grand. But I've never really had any big hobbies, and I don't have much material desire, so I can live without pushing myself too hard. For me, it's more important to work without stress than to live a life of luxury. The reason for that goes back 4 years. 4 years ago, I was working as a full-time employee at a different company. I was at the prime working age, and because of my age, I was given significant tasks to handle, so I worked tirelessly, sacrificing my personal life. Working overtime was my routine, and I even worked on my days off. Sometimes, I cut back on sleep and meal times to work. At first, I was happy to see my work performance improving, but gradually, I accumulated physical fatigue. However, I was afraid that if I reduced my workload, my performance would drop, so I couldn't hold back on work. The place I used to work was what you'd call a sweatshop, where yelling was an everyday occurrence and mistakes were often deducted from my paycheck. Sarcastic comments and verbal abuse from my boss, a man named Tony, towards his less capable subordinates were a daily occurrence. One day, I found myself frozen in front of the office, while thinking that I had to go in. I just couldn't bring myself to enter the building. Eventually, I went to a hospital and was diagnosed with overwork depression. I was scared, but I thought it was dangerous to continue as it was, so I somehow managed to quit. The angry calls from my boss were relentless, and there were times when he even came to my house, pounding on the door and shouting, "Come out," like a debt collector. But after spending my days holed up in my room without showing my face, he finally gave up. 4 years have passed and my overwork depression has completely healed. Now, I wonder why I didn't sue the company, or why I didn't seek help from the proper authorities, but I think my judgment was clouded at the time. I'm surprised that such companies still exist in modern America, where work-style diversification is progressing. I'm really glad I quit. After that, I switched to being a temp worker. I didn't tell my mother about my overwork depression, but perhaps she sensed something from my sudden resignation and switched to temp work. She simply said, "Do what you want." This is the 4th company I've worked for since becoming a temp worker. I go about my days unobtrusively, calmly performing the tasks assigned to me. This company recently experienced a change in leadership, as the previous CEO suddenly passed away 6 months ago, and his daughter, a woman named Susan Redstone, took over as CEO. 40-year-old Susan is a hard-working career woman with strong, beautiful eyes. She seems busy, and temp workers like me hardly ever see her. Today, like every day, I was taking care of the plants during a break in my work. The previous CEO was fond of plants, and so many potted plants were left behind in the office. They were taken care of by the previous CEO, but when no one else stepped up to the task, I took it on. In fact, I also grow plants in my private life. When I was suffering from overwork depression, I wanted to feel something with a strong life force around me. I couldn't afford a pet, so I chose low-maintenance houseplants. It was meant to be a comfort, but the effect was phenomenal. I felt healed looking at the greenery, and just looking at the vibrant leaves full of life seemed to make my day better. Since then, I've become a plant lover. I not only have houseplants at home, but also vegetables and flowers planted in planters. So caring for the office plants, which were left without a caretaker, was just part of my hobby. But my temp period is almost over. I was worried about the plants. Shortly before my temp period ended, I had the opportunity to greet the CEO. It was the first time I had greeted her since she took over from her father, whom I had greeted when I started working at this temp job. I was only here for a short time, but thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you too. You've worked hard. Our new CEO, Mrs. Susan Redstone, speaks with such understatement, showing no interest in a temp like me. The same goes for the potted plants. The large potted plants in the CEO's office seemed to be watered, but they appeared lifeless. Susan. I nervously wondered if it was my place to speak up to the CEO, but nonetheless, I began to speak. Can you find someone who can take care of the plants? The previous CEO cared for these plants with love. Plants? Oh, that's right. My father left lots of planters around the company, didn't he? Finally, it seemed like the CEO remembered. She must have been too busy to even notice the plants. You've been taking care of them. I have a few plants at home. Being able to spend my spare time at work with the plants was a healing experience. At my words, the CEO fell silent, lost in thought, and after a while, she simply said, "I see." That was the end of the day. But on my last day as a temp, the CEO called me in again. Alone in the CEO's office, she started to ask me various things. What are your plans for the future? Where's your next temp assignment? Well, I haven't figured that out yet. I'm having trouble even finding a place to live. It's quite a predicament. Ha. At my mumbled response, the CEO reacted sharply, leaning forward. You haven't decided yet, that's good. But you mentioned having trouble finding a place to live. Is there an issue with your current place? Well, I've been asked to move out, but I'm having trouble finding a good apartment. I currently live in an old shabby apartment. The only good thing about it is the low rent. As a temp, you never know when work will stop, so I can't afford to spend money on rent. That's why my old apartment, with its cheap rent and basic amenities like a bath and toilet, was perfect. But the landlord, who was also the owner, retired. His son took over and quickly decided to demolish the building. If they claim it's due to aging, residents can't object. So now, I'm on the verge of losing my job and home all at once. When I told the CEO this, she hurried towards me, the heels of her shoes clicking on the floor. Then, she leaned in close. The CEO has such flawless skin that it's hard to believe she's 40. While I was being mesmerized by her, she suddenly made an unexpected proposal. I'll give you money if you live with me. I was so surprised by the beautiful CEO's sudden request that I fell back onto the floor. I mean, it was that shocking. 3 days later, I was standing in the living room of the CEO's family home. Just a moment ago, the CEO had shown me around the house and I had just caught my breath. I guess that's the end of the tour. I gave you the keys, right? My room is empty. I've moved everything to my current place, so there aren't any rooms you need to avoid. Feel free to use them as you wish. If you find anything uncomfortable or broken, let me know anytime. With that, the CEO left for work. She seems to be busy today as well. I sat down on the sofa, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past 3 days. Then will you live with me? She asked me on my last day of temping was not with her, but with a multitude of plants that the previous CEO had left in his family home after his death. Apparently, the CEO's mother passed away when she was young, and her only family was her father, the previous CEO. Now that the previous CEO has passed away, the CEO's family home, where I am now, is vacant. The CEO is currently living alone near her family home and plans to move back to the family home after her father's death. But even after half a year, she's still so busy that she can't spare the time to move. But a vacant house deteriorates quickly. Not to mention, the CEO's family home is full of plants left by the previous CEO who loved plants. There are plants not only in planters, but also in the garden. Right now, the garden is a little overgrown. But the CEO seems to be a bit neurotic, and she doesn't like the idea of workers coming into her house or garden when she's not there. So I ended up being the one chosen for the task. The CEO found out I had been taking care of the office plants and asked my bosses and colleagues about me. She seemed to have investigated what kind of person I was. Then she decided to entrust me with the management of her family home and taking care of the plants there. The arrangement was until the CEO could move back home once her work had settled down. Of course, I was hesitant at first. No. I haven't really talked to the CEO much, have I? Just because you ask my bosses and colleagues. What will you do if I run away with the things in the house? The CEO laughed off my words. There's no reason to leave anything valuable in an empty house. I've already moved everything to my apartment. The only things left in the house are plants and items of little value. And even though we only talked a little, I get the feeling that you're a good person. I'd like you to take this as a middle-aged woman's ramblings, not a business person's. I've always been good at judging people. and I've got a decent grasp of your personal information since we hired you through an agency. If you do anything strange, I'll report you immediately, so don't worry." All I could do was give a bitter smile. But as long as I was living in the CEO's family home and taking care of the cleaning and the plants, I would get paid. It wasn't a bad deal for me, as I could look for a new apartment during that time. And so, I ended up living in the CEO's family home. 2 weeks after I started living in the CEO's house, the CEO, I now call her Susan, sometimes came to check on the place. She always seemed exhausted from her work. For such a tired Susan, I prepared a homemade meal. After my recovery from overwork depression, I started to pay attention to my diet and got into cooking. Though my menu was very simple: meat and potatoes, soup, spinach salad, and stir-fried root vegetables. But Susan seemed to be really pleased. She didn't have time and often relied on bread and nutrition drinks and jellies for meals. Having a homemade meal and sharing a leisurely meal with someone else after such a long time, it's relaxing. Thank you so much. Susan was more delighted than I had imagined. No, I'm thankful to be allowed to live here. I thought I could at least return the favor. From that day on, Susan started coming over occasionally to check up and have meals. I also enjoyed the time I spent around the dining table with Susan. Susan at home was completely different from her image at work. At home, the career woman in her toned down, lounging on the sofa, eating a lot despite her thin body, and hanging around, saying it was too troublesome to return to her apartment. No one in the company knows about this side of her. I was happy to think that I was the only one who knew about it. On the contrary, I felt lonely in the quiet house on the days Susan didn't come. About 2 months after I started living in Susan's house, Susan brought some alcohol as a thank you for the meals, and I prepared some snacks, and we drank together. Susan, who was quite drunk, weakly shared her past. "I'm divorced, you know. My ex-husband cheated on me, but it was my fault. I was too absorbed in my work, and I neglected my relationship with him. When I found out about his affair, I blamed him. Then he said, 'You never tried to make time for me, did you? Your work is important to you, isn't it? I want to be with someone who cares about me.'" Susan seemed to have realized then. She had been leaving her ex-husband lonely. "Well, my ex-husband is remarried and happy. I've learned my lesson, and we've reconciled because he understands that I'm a workaholic. But the real problem is my father." At that point, Susan lifted her face, which had been down. Beyond Susan's gaze was a photo of her with her late father, the former CEO. Did something happen with the former CEO? I had a bad relationship with my father. We both were absorbed in our work, and we often clashed. I couldn't easily apologize to my father. We had a fight over work a few days before he died, and we ended up parting on bad terms. I'm sure my father would have preferred a daughter who was more honest and had a good parent-child relationship. Susan seemed to deeply regret having ended up in a fight with a former CEO. I wish I could have said something nice, but I couldn't find the words to comfort Susan. I wish I had more meals and drinks with my father. Susan seemed to be drunk and fell asleep. I thought that Susan, our new CEO, was a workaholic, but it turned out she was just a normal woman struggling with a relationship with her father. Ever since I started living at Susan's place, I feel like I've come to know many unexpected sides of her. One night, when she had fallen asleep drunk, I gently covered her with a blanket. A few days after that, Susan asked me to clean the room of the former CEO. She seemed to have roughly organized the visible areas before, but apparently she hadn't gotten to the closet yet. Until then, the cleaning tasks I had been entrusted with were things like vacuuming, dusting, and window cleaning. This was the first time she asked me to organize the inside of the closet. While I was nervous, I felt happy thinking that she trusted me. And then I found it. Something. Looking at it, I thought that this was beyond my capabilities to organize, so I had Susan come over on her day off. What can't be organized by anyone but me. I thought I had all the bank books and such with me. There's no bank book. Look at this. I opened a box that I found in the closet in the former CEO's room in front of Susan. What came out was her childhood essays, certificates, albums, and so on. "Susan, I know you've been concerned about your troubled relationship with your father. thinking he must have wanted a more obedient daughter, but surely that's not the case. Look, he's even written memories and messages by hand in this album. To the former CEO, you were his beloved and prideful daughter. If not, he wouldn't have kept these essays and certificates so preciously. Few people keep such childhood memories. Even I became a bit emotional. I had no idea he kept these. Susan picked up each item the former CEO had stored, holding them gently. He was a loving man, wasn't he? Maybe the former CEO was just like you, struggling to express his feelings in words, but he was always thinking about you. As I said that, I continued to stroke Susan's back as she cried. A month later, the date was finally set for Susan to return to her family home. When I was thinking about moving out, Susan looked at me with a serious expression. "Will you marry me? I'll give you everything I have." Surprised, I swallowed and stared back into Susan's eyes. Even a slowpoke like me had noticed Susan's affection for me since I started living here. It was evident in her gaze and expressions. And it was the same for me. I feel the same way. Will you live with me from now on? At my words, Susan showed me the biggest smile I've ever seen. "I can't cook or clean at all. Is that okay? I am pretty good at the things you're not. You know that, right? We could make a great couple." We both chuckled together. And then, we successfully started dating. And we are living together in Susan's family home. Susan is still busy as ever, but she makes adjustments to her work so we can eat together as much as possible, while being soothed by the plants. It was Susan who suggested that we should try to eat together. I don't want to have regrets. I want to take care of you in my own way. I was glad to feel Susan's affection. I've been taking a lot of pictures of Susan, and I've been adding them to the album that my father-in-law carefully kept in the box. It's to allow her Father in heaven to see his beloved daughter. I want to continue to be a couple who talk a lot, spend time together, and cherish each other.